It was a typical, uneventful evening when I first stumbled upon the post. I was aimlessly scrolling through a dark corner of Reddit, a place where the forgotten and the bizarre are shared without restraint. The forum was a collection of the internet's most unsettling stories. Tales of haunted houses, cursed objects, and paranormal encounters. It was the kind of place that thrived on fear. Yet something about it always piqued my curiosity. That night, a particular post caught my eye. Its title, simple but chilling: The Forgotten Diary. The post was lengthy, filled with disjointed paragraphs and cryptic details. The original poster, whose username was an indecipherable string of numbers and letters, described how they had come across an old leather-bound diary in a dusty, forgotten corner of an antiquarian bookstore. The diary, they claimed, was no ordinary journal. It was a record of events that seemed to predict the future, events that were dark, violent, and deeply disturbing. As I read, I felt a strange mix of skepticism and unease. The post was well written, almost too well, and I found myself questioning whether it was just a creative writing exercise meant to spook the readers. But something about the way it was written, the attention to detail, the way the words seemed to echo with a hidden truth, made it hard to dismiss. The poster claimed that after reading the diary, strange things began happening around them. They started receiving anonymous messages, hearing voices in the dead of night and seeing shadowy figures at the edges of their vision. It all felt like a carefully crafted tale, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something real behind it. Despite my better judgment, I found myself increasingly drawn into the story. The poster mentioned specific locations: abandoned buildings, overgrown cemeteries, forgotten back alleys, where they had found eerie correlations between the diary's entries and real-life events. They hinted at a terrible secret hidden within the diary, something that had cost previous owners their sanity, or worse. The more I read, the more I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. My rational mind told me to stop, to close the browser and forget about it, but I couldn't. There was a magnetic pull, something that kept me clicking through the pages, drawn deeper into the web of mystery and terror. It wasn't long before I began noticing the timestamps. The diary's entries didn't just predict the future. They matched the dates of some of the most horrific events in recent history. Each entry was a precise, grim foretelling of disaster, from brutal crimes to tragic accidents. The connection was undeniable, and it sent a chill down my spine. I started to feel a creeping paranoia, as though by reading this post, I was inviting something sinister into my own life. But it was too late to turn back. I had to know more. My mind raced with possibilities. What if this diary was real? What if the original poster had discovered something that was never meant to be found? And what if by reading about it, I was putting myself at risk? The questions swirled in my head, each one darker and more terrifying than the last. I felt a gnawing fear at the pit of my stomach, a sense of impending doom that I couldn't shake off. I wanted to stop, to forget I had ever come across this cursed story. But I knew I wouldn't be able to rest until I had uncovered the truth. As I scrolled to the end of the post, my heart nearly stopped. The final lines were a warning, written in frantic, almost desperate tones. The poster claimed that they were being watched, that something was coming for them, and that anyone who read the diary was in danger. They begged anyone who stumbled upon the post to leave it alone, to forget they had ever seen it. But the message was too late. I had already gone too far. I clicked away from the forum, my hands trembling. The room felt colder, the shadows longer. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had opened a door to something dark and malignant, something that wouldn't rest until it had claimed me, too. The night was silent, yet I could feel an oppressive weight in the air. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside my window sent shivers down my spine. I knew deep down that my life had just taken a dark turn, and as I lay in bed, eyes wide open, I realized that I had made a grave mistake. The diary wasn't just a story, it was a curse, and now I was a part of it. As the days passed, the story of the forgotten diary refused to leave my mind. It lingered in the shadows of my thoughts, resurfacing in the quiet moments when I was alone, as if it were a malevolent presence that had taken root in my psyche. The post had mentioned several names, people who had supposedly owned the diary before the original poster, each meeting a fate more horrifying than the last. But something about the way those names were written felt off, like they were hiding something, concealing a deeper truth. Driven by a mix of dread and an overwhelming need to understand what I had gotten myself into, I decided to go back to the post and reread it, this time with a more critical eye. But when I searched for the original thread, it was gone. The entire post had been deleted, leaving behind nothing but a void where it once existed. Panic set in as I realized that I hadn't saved it, hadn't taken screenshots, and now it was as if the story had never existed at all. But the memory of those names lingered, names that seemed ordinary enough at first glance but had an uncanny ability to stick in my mind. I tried to recall them, jotting down the few I could remember. Michael, Sarah, David, Emily. Common names, but they sent a shiver through me as I wrote them. Something didn't feel right. Why did these names unsettle me so much? And why was I so convinced that there was more to them than met the eye? The original poster had warned about the dangers of the diary, about how it could twist reality, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the names were somehow part of that twisting. In a moment of clarity, I decided to do something I hadn't considered before. I would change the names. If the diary had the power to affect reality, perhaps altering the names could sever its hold on me. I would rewrite the story in my mind, substituting new identities for the characters, as though I could somehow protect myself by distancing them from the original tale. It was a desperate act, born of fear, but it was all I could think to do. I sat down with my notebook, the dim light of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room, and began the process. Michael became Ethan, Sarah turned into Lisa, David transformed into Mark, and Emily was now Claire. As I wrote each new name, I felt a strange sensation, like the air around me was shifting, growing thicker, more oppressive. The more I wrote, the more the room seemed to close in on me, as though the walls were watching, waiting. But I pressed on, determined to finish what I had started. When I was done, I stared at the page, the names glaring back at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I had done the right thing. But the fear in the pit of my stomach told a different story. The new names felt foreign, wrong somehow, as if I had tampered with something that was not meant to be altered. But it was too late to turn back now. That night, the nightmares began. They were vivid, terrifying visions that felt more real than any dream should. I saw Ethan, formerly Michael, standing in a darkened room, his face obscured by shadows. He was whispering something, words that I couldn't quite make out, but they filled me with a sense of dread so profound it was suffocating. Then there was Lisa, once Sarah, crying in a corner, her tears black as ink staining the floor beneath her. Mark, who had been David, appeared next, his eyes wide with terror, as if he had seen something unspeakable. And finally Claire, formerly Emily, stood before me, her face pale, lips moving soundlessly, yet her eyes spoke of an agony that pierced through me like a blade. I woke up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the echoes of the nightmare still reverberating in my mind. The names had changed, but the terror remained, more potent than before. I realized with growing horror that my attempt to alter the story had only made things worse. The characters in the diary weren't just names on a page, they were people, or had been, and by changing their names, I had disturbed whatever tenuous connection they had to this world. I had tried to protect myself by creating distance, but instead I had drawn them closer, inviting them into my life. The days that followed were a blur of fear and paranoia. Everywhere I went, I felt watched, followed by the lingering presence of those I had tried to rename. I would catch glimpses of them in reflections, shadows, the corner of my eye, always there, but never fully in sight. The air around me was heavy with their presence, a constant reminder that they were no longer bound to the diary alone. I had unleashed something far worse than what had originally haunted them, and now they were free to haunt me. I began to doubt everything. My reality felt fractured, every small sound, every fleeting shadow a potential threat. I was no longer just a reader of the story. I was part of it, trapped in a nightmare of my own making. The names were supposed to protect me, to break the curse, but instead, they had become the very chains that bound me to this hellish existence. I had opened a door that should have remained closed, and now I had to live with the consequences, or die by them. The days turned into a blur as I became more obsessed with unraveling the mystery behind the forgotten diary. Despite the terror that now seemed to cling to my every waking moment, I couldn't stop thinking about the post, the names, and the diary itself. I felt a compulsive need to dig deeper, to uncover whatever truth lay buried beneath the layers of fear and madness. It was as if the diary had embedded itself into my mind, whispering dark secrets that I could not ignore. I began by retracing the steps mentioned in the original post, starting with the locations that were supposedly linked to the diary's predictions. Each place held a sinister air, as if time itself had forgotten them. I visited an old decrepit building that had once been a bustling factory, but was now little more than a crumbling shell. The post had claimed that the diary foretold a tragic accident here, and as I walked through the abandoned corridors, I could almost hear the echoes of the past. Faint cries, the clanging of machinery, and the distant wail of a siren that never came. But it wasn't just the physical locations that unnerved me. Strange things began happening online as well, events that I couldn't explain. It started with minor glitches, my computer freezing, files disappearing or reappearing in places they shouldn't be. At first I brushed it off as nothing more than technical issues, but as the incidents grew more frequent and more disturbing, I realized that something far more sinister was at play. One night, as I was searching through forums and obscure websites for any mention of the diary, my screen suddenly went black. For a moment I thought my computer had died, but then a message appeared. White text on a black background, stark and menacing. "You shouldn't have done that." My heart skipped a beat, and I stared at the screen in shock. The message blinked off, and the screen returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. But the unease that settled over me was undeniable. Someone, or something, was watching me. The online disturbances didn't stop there. My email inbox started receiving strange messages from unknown addresses. The subject lines were cryptic, filled with random characters and symbols, but the body of each email was even more unsettling. They contained fragments of text, as if they were excerpts from the diary itself, predictions of horrific events that hadn't yet come to pass, each one more chilling than the last. The emails would vanish almost as quickly as they appeared, deleted without a trace, leaving me questioning whether I'd really seen them at all. Social media became a nightmare of its own. I would scroll through my feed only to find unsettling images spliced into my timeline. Photos of places I recognized from the post, but altered, distorted, as if seen through a lens of pure malice. Shadows seemed to crawl across the images, forming shapes that defied logic. Faces twisted in silent screams, eyes that stared back at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. Every time I tried to screenshot these images, my phone would crash, the images disappearing as soon as I rebooted it. It wasn't just online either. The terror began to bleed into my real life. My phone would ring at odd hours, the caller ID displaying numbers that didn't make sense. Strings of zeros or random digits that didn't belong to any known area code. When I answered, all I would hear was static, sometimes interrupted by faint whispers, too low to understand, but enough to send shivers down my spine. I stopped answering after the third call, but the ringing would continue, echoing through the empty house. A constant reminder that I was no longer alone. One night I woke to the sound of typing. Groggy and disoriented, I realized it was coming from my computer. I hadn't left it on, but the screen was glowing faintly in the darkness, and I could see the cursor moving on its own, typing out a message letter by letter. I watched in frozen horror as the words took shape. "You are part of it now." The cursor blinked a few times, as if waiting for a response. My hands trembled as I reached out, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, but I couldn't bring myself to type anything. The screen went black again, leaving me in a silence that was more suffocating than the noise. By this point, I was trapped in a waking nightmare. My life overtaken by a darkness I couldn't escape. The diary's influence was growing, not just as a concept or a story, but as a real, tangible force that was invading every aspect of my existence. The line between the virtual world and reality was blurring, and I could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. Every shadow, every fleeting movement at the edge of my vision filled me with dread, as if the diary's cursed presence was inching closer, tightening its grip around me. I tried to reach out for help, but the few friends I confided in dismissed my experiences as paranoia, hallucinations brought on by stress and lack of sleep. But I knew better. I could feel it. The cold, unyielding truth that I was no longer in control. The diary had latched on to me, and it was using the digital world to reach into my life, manipulating my surroundings, feeding on my fear. The online mystery wasn't just a part of the diary's tale. It was the diary itself, a sentient force that had found a new way to extend its curse beyond the pages to anyone foolish enough to delve too deeply. And now, I was ensnared in its web, caught in a game that I could neither understand nor escape. The more I searched for answers, the deeper I sank into the darkness, until there was nothing left but the chilling certainty that the diary had claimed me, body and soul. It was late, well past midnight, when the first encounter happened. The house was silent, the kind of silence that presses down on you, making you acutely aware of every creak and groan the building makes as it settles. I was sitting at my desk, staring at my computer screen, trying to make sense of the fragmented clues I'd gathered. The strange emails, the mysterious glitches, the eerie images that seemed to seep into my life from some dark corner of the internet. They all pointed to something far beyond my understanding, something malevolent and ancient. I was exhausted, my eyes heavy from lack of sleep, but I couldn't stop. I felt like I was on the brink of a discovery, like the answers were just within reach, if I could only piece everything together. But as I clicked through the last few links, my screen froze, and a cold gust of air swept through the room. I glanced around, puzzled. The windows were closed and the heating had been off for hours. Yet there was a distinct chill in the air, one that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Suddenly the lights flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a split second before they came back on. Dimmer than before. My heart started to race and I told myself it was just a power surge, nothing more. But the atmosphere had shifted, the air thick with an almost palpable tension. I could feel it. Something was wrong. Something was here with me. I turned back to my computer screen, and that's when I saw it, a reflection in the monitor just behind me. It was faint, barely discernible in the glow of the screen, but it was there, an indistinct shadowy figure standing at the far corner of the room. My breath caught in my throat as I whipped around, but there was nothing there, just the empty room. The silence was deafening, and for a moment I wondered if my mind was playing tricks on me. The product of too many sleepless nights and too much time spent chasing shadows. But when I looked back at the monitor, the figure was still there, now closer, just a few feet behind my chair. Panic surged through me and I spun around again, this time standing up, my chair toppling over as I did. The room was still empty, but the oppressive feeling of being watched was undeniable. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I could feel a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. I reached for the light switch, flipping it on and off, but the dim light did nothing to dispel the growing sense of dread. Desperately, I grabbed my phone, its small screen, casting a weak light in the darkness. I pointed it toward the corner where the figure had been, my hand shaking so badly that the light danced across the walls. I saw nothing, just the same empty corner, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was there, lurking just out of sight, waiting. Then, the smell hit me. It was faint at first, like the scent of damp earth after a rainstorm, but it quickly grew stronger, more pungent. It was the unmistakable stench of decay, of something long dead and buried. The air grew thick with it, so heavy I could taste it at the back of my throat, and I gagged, backing away from the corner, my eyes watering. There was something deeply wrong here, something that defied all logic and reason. I backed up until I was pressed against the wall, my phone still clutched in my hand like a lifeline. I stared at the corner, my eyes straining to see in the dim light, but there was nothing. Nothing but that horrible smell and the suffocating sense of dread. I was frozen, too terrified to move, every instinct screaming at me to run, to get out of the house. But my legs refused to obey. Then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It was coming from the darkness, from the very spot where the figure had been. The voice was low, guttural, like it was coming from deep within the earth itself. It wasn't speaking any language I recognized, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a warning, a threat, a promise of something terrible yet to come. The words crawled over my skin like 1,000 insects, making my flesh prickle with fear. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, but it only grew louder, more insistent. The smell of decay was overwhelming now, choking me, filling my lungs with its rancid stench. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out. With a burst of adrenaline, I bolted from the room, my phone slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. I didn't stop to pick it up, didn't even look back as I sprinted down the hallway, my footsteps echoing through the empty house. The whispering followed me, growing louder, more frantic, until it was a roar in my ears. It was like the house itself was alive, pulsing with a dark energy that was trying to swallow me whole. I burst through the front door and into the night, the cold air hitting me like a slap to the face. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street, my lungs burning, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. When I finally came to a stop, I turned back to look at the house. It was dark, silent, the windows staring back at me like dead eyes. But even from that distance, I could feel it, the presence, the malevolent force that had taken hold of my home. It was still there, watching, waiting for me to return. I knew then that I had crossed a line, that whatever I had been searching for had found me instead. The diary, the post, the strange events, they were all connected, part of something much bigger and far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. And now, there was no escaping it. I had awakened something dark and ancient, and it wasn't going to let me go. As I stood there, trembling in the cold night air, I realized that this was only the beginning. The first encounter had been a warning, a glimpse into the horrors that awaited me. And deep down, I knew that whatever came next would be far worse. After that first, terrifying encounter, my life began to spiral into a nightmare that I couldn't escape. The terror that had started as a whisper in the dark grew louder with each passing day until it was all-consuming, a relentless force that gnawed at my sanity. The boundary between reality and the supernatural was dissolving, leaving me trapped in a world where every shadow, every fleeting noise, was a reminder that something malevolent was watching, waiting to strike. The house, once a place of comfort and safety, had become a prison. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, closing in on me, suffocating me with their silent, oppressive presence. The air was thick with dread, heavy with the stench of decay that never fully dissipated. No matter how many windows I opened or how much fresh air I tried to bring in, it clung to me, followed me like a dark cloud, a constant reminder of the presence that had invaded my home. The supernatural events escalated with a terrifying intensity. At first it was small things, doors that creaked open on their own, lights that flickered despite fresh bulbs, objects that moved when I wasn't looking. But soon the disturbances grew bolder, more malicious. I would wake in the middle of the night to find my furniture rearranged, as if some unseen force had been carefully constructing a sinister tableau while I slept. Chairs would be positioned around my bed, facing me, as though an invisible audience had been watching me in my most vulnerable moments. My books, once neatly stacked on the shelves, would be scattered across the floor, their pages torn, passages scrawled over with dark, incomprehensible symbols. Then came the voices, disembodied whispers that filled the silence of the house, murmuring from just out of sight. They were everywhere, surrounding me, creeping into my thoughts, distorting my sense of reality. They spoke in tongues, in languages I didn't understand. Their tones, a mixture of mockery and malice. They seemed to echo my deepest fears, amplifying them, feeding off my terror. Sometimes, I could hear them calling my name, dragging it out in long, drawn-out syllables that sent chills down my spine. The sense of being watched became unbearable. No matter where I was in the house, I could feel eyes on me. Cold, calculating, filled with a malice that was almost palpable. I would catch glimpses of movement in the mirrors, in the windows, fleeting shadows that darted out of sight the moment I turned to confront them. The reflection in the bathroom mirror became a source of dread. It no longer felt like my own. I would avoid looking at it directly, afraid that I would see something standing behind me. Something not of this world. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I was haunted by nightmares so vivid they felt more real than the waking world. The figures from the diary, the ones whose names I had tried to change, returned to me in these dreams. Their faces twisted in agony, their eyes hollow and accusing. They would reach out to me with skeletal hands, their voices echoing with the weight of centuries of suffering. The dreams were so intense that I would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, my heart racing with the residual terror. But the worst was the sense of inevitability, the growing realization that the horror was no longer confined to my home. It was following me everywhere. At work, I began to notice things out of place. My computer screen flickering with the same cryptic messages I had seen before, coworkers giving me strange looks as if they sensed the darkness that clung to me. My phone calls were often interrupted by bursts of static, interspersed with faint, otherworldly whispers that I could never quite decipher. Even in the streets, I felt the presence, a coldness that seemed to follow me, the shadows longer and darker than they should be. One evening, as I was walking home, I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The streetlights flickered above me, casting long, eerie shadows that danced in the corners of my vision. I quickened my pace, my breath coming in shallow gasps, but the feeling only intensified. I knew, without a doubt, that I was not alone. I could hear footsteps behind me, soft at first, then growing louder, more deliberate. I turned around, but there was nothing there, just the empty street stretching out. Behind me, bathed in the dim glow of the streetlights, but the footsteps didn't stop. They continued, growing closer, more insistent, until they were right behind me. Panic seized me, and I broke into a run, my footsteps echoing off the pavement, the sound of my pursuer never far behind. I didn't dare look back again, afraid of what I might see. I ran until I reached my house, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly that it took several tries before I could unlock the door. I slammed it shut behind me, locking it, bolting it, but the sense of dread remained, stronger than ever. The lights in the house flickered as I stood there, gasping for breath, my back pressed against the door. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling the air with their sinister murmurings. I could hear them all around me, seeping through the walls, rising from the floor, descending from the ceiling. They were closing in on me, tightening their grip, driving me to the brink of madness. Then, in the darkness, I saw it, the shadowy figure from before, standing in the middle of the room, its form barely visible in the dim light. It was taller now, more defined, and its presence was suffocating, filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its eyes on me, boring into me, as if it was studying me, waiting for something. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The figure began to move toward me, slowly, deliberately, its steps almost soundless. As it approached, the lights dimmed further until the room was nearly pitch black, the only illumination coming from the figure itself, a shadow within the shadows. I could feel the cold emanating from it, a bone-chilling cold that seeped into my very soul. It stopped just inches away from me, its presence overwhelming. The whispers grew louder, more frenzied, filling my head with a cacophony of voices that drowned out all rational thought. The figure leaned in, and though it had no discernible face, I could feel it smiling, a cruel, malevolent smile that sent waves of terror crashing over me. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The lights flickered back on, the whispers ceased, and I was left standing alone in the now silent room, my heart racing, my body trembling. But I knew that this was far from over. The figure had shown itself, made its presence known, and I understood that this was only the beginning of something far darker, far more terrifying than anything I had ever imagined. The horror had escalated. The boundaries between our worlds had blurred, and I was caught in the middle. A pawn in a game I didn't understand. The diary, the presence, the whispers, they were all connected, part of a nightmare that was tightening its grip around me, drawing me deeper into its dark, suffocating embrace. And as I stood there, alone in the silence, I realized with a sinking dread that there was no escape. The terror had only just begun. The days that followed were a descent into madness, a slow unraveling of everything I thought I knew. The terror that had engulfed my life was no longer just a series of horrifying events. It had become a living, breathing entity, feeding on my fear, growing stronger with each passing moment. The presence that haunted my every step was no longer content with merely watching. It was beginning to reveal its true nature, and with it, the terrible secret at the heart of the forgotten diary. I became obsessed with uncovering the truth, driven by a need to understand what had been unleashed upon me. I pored over every scrap of information I could find, delving into obscure forums, ancient texts, and long-forgotten occult writings. The more I searched, the more I realized that the diary was far older and far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. It wasn't just a cursed object. It was a gateway, a conduit for something far more sinister. The first revelation came one night as I was going through the diary entries that I had managed to reconstruct from memory. Among the disjointed ramblings and cryptic prophecies, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Certain phrases, certain names, seemed to be repeated as if they were part of a larger pattern. I wrote them down, rearranging them, and slowly, a chilling picture began to emerge. The diary wasn't just predicting events, it was documenting the actions of a cult, a group of individuals who had, over centuries, dedicated themselves to summoning a being of immense and malevolent power. This being, referred to only as the Watcher, was a creature that existed beyond our reality, a dark force that could manipulate time, space, and the very fabric of existence. The cult had been using the diary as a tool, a way to communicate with the Watcher, to bring its influence into our world. But the diary was more than just a communication device. It was a trap. Each person who came into possession of the diary became a link in a chain, bound to the Watcher through the very act of reading its pages. The entries I had read, the names I had changed, they were all part of a ritual that I had unwittingly completed. And now, the Watcher had turned its gaze upon me. The second revelation was even more horrifying. As I delved deeper into the diary's history, I discovered references to a blood pact, a ritual that bound the souls of the cult members to the Watcher. In exchange for their service, they were granted power, immortality, but at a terrible cost. Their souls were trapped, forever bound to the diary, unable to move on. unable to escape the torment of the Watcher's influence. They were the shadows that haunted me, the whispers that filled my mind with terror. They were the ones whose names I had tried to change, whose identities I had altered, and by doing so, I had drawn them closer, given them power over me. But the worst revelation came when I found an entry that wasn't like the others. It was newer, written in a shaky hand, the ink smeared as if the writer had been trembling with fear. The entry described a final ritual, one that would fully bring the Watcher into our world. It was a ritual that required a sacrifice, a living soul offered willingly to the Watcher, a soul that would serve as its vessel, allowing it to manifest fully in our reality. The entry ended abruptly, the last words scrawled hastily. "It has chosen. The sacrifice has been marked." I felt a cold chill run down my spine as I realized the truth. The diary hadn't just been a record of past events. It had been a guide, a roadmap leading to this very moment. I was the sacrifice. The events that had been unfolding around me, the terror that had been growing, it was all leading to this. The Watcher had chosen me, marked me as its vessel, and now it was only a matter of time before the final ritual was completed. I tried to think of a way out, some way to break the curse, to stop the ritual before it could be completed. But every lead I followed, every ritual I researched, led to the same conclusion. Once marked, the sacrifice could not escape. The only way to stop the Watcher was to destroy the diary, but doing so would also destroy me, for I was now bound to it, my soul linked to its cursed pages. The realization hit me like a physical blow. There was no escape. The horror that had consumed my life was only the beginning. The Watcher was coming, and when it did, it would bring with it a darkness that would swallow everything. I was nothing more than a pawn in a game that had been played out over centuries, a game that was now reaching its final, terrifying conclusion. In the days that followed, I felt the presence of the Watcher growing stronger, its influence seeping into every aspect of my life. The shadows that had once been mere glimpses now loomed over me, their forms more solid, more real. The whispers were louder, more insistent, and I could feel them burrowing into my mind, filling my thoughts with dark, twisted images of what was to come. I began to lose track of time, my days and nights blending into one another in a haze of fear and confusion. Sleep was impossible, for every time I closed my eyes, I was assaulted by visions of the Watcher, its form shifting, monstrous, beyond comprehension. It spoke to me in a voice that was both a whisper and a roar, promising power, promising oblivion, promising an end to all suffering. But I knew better. I knew that the only thing the Watcher offered was eternal torment, a fate far worse than death. And yet as the days passed, I could feel my will weakening, the darkness creeping into my soul, corrupting my thoughts, my desires. I was becoming what it wanted, a willing vessel, a conduit for its malevolent power. The final revelation came in a moment of clarity, a brief respite from the overwhelming terror that had become my life. I realized that there was only one way to stop the Watcher, to break the cycle that had claimed so many lives before mine. I had to destroy the diary, even if it meant destroying myself in the process. It was the only way to end the horror, to stop the Watcher from entering our world. But as I made my decision, I knew that it would not be easy. The diary had a will of its own, a dark intelligence that would not allow itself to be destroyed so easily. And the Watcher was always watching, always waiting, ready to strike at the first sign of defiance. I prepared myself for what was to come, knowing that the final battle would be fought not with weapons, but with willpower, with the strength to resist the darkness that had taken hold of me. I knew that it would be a fight for my very soul, a fight that I could not afford to lose. And as I stared into the pages of the diary, the pages that had brought so much terror into my life, I steeled myself for the inevitable confrontation, knowing that the fate of my soul, and perhaps the world, hung in the balance. The night was suffocating, the air thick with the promise of something unspeakable. I could feel it all around me, the darkness closing in, the oppressive weight of a presence that defied comprehension. The Watcher was near, closer than it had ever been. and I knew that tonight would be the night when everything would come to a head. The final confrontation was inevitable, and the terror that had plagued me for so long had reached a fever pitch. Every nerve in my body screaming in anticipation of the horrors yet to come. I stood in the center of my living room, the cursed diary clutched in my trembling hands. The room around me seemed to pulse with a life of its own, the shadows creeping along the walls, growing darker and more defined. The temperature had plummeted, the air freezing cold, but I was drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and determination, knowing that this was my last chance to stop the Watcher before it could fully enter our world. The house had been transformed into a place of nightmares. Every corner was filled with darkness so thick it felt like a living entity, crawling toward me, wrapping around my ankles, tugging at my sanity. The walls, once familiar and comforting, now seemed to stretch and bend, closing in on me, trapping me in a cage of my own making. The whispers had returned, louder and more insistent than ever, filling the air with their maddening cacophony. They were everywhere, surrounding me, penetrating my thoughts, eroding my will. But worse than the whispers were the shadows, figures that had once been fleeting, barely noticeable, now fully formed and terrifyingly real. They were the souls of those who had come before me, bound to the Watcher, their forms twisted and grotesque, their eyes hollow and accusing. They watched me with a malevolent hunger, their bodies flickering in and out of existence, as if caught between this world and the next. I could feel their anger, their pain, their despair, all directed at me, the one who had unwittingly taken up their cursed burden. And then I saw it, the figure that had haunted my nightmares, the being that had stalked me through shadows and whispers. The Watcher was here. It stood at the far end of the room, a towering figure of darkness, its form shifting and writhing as if it were made of the very shadows that consumed the house. It had no face, no eyes, but I could feel its gaze upon me, a gaze that pierced through to my very soul. The air around it was thick with malevolence, a cold so intense that it burned, a silence so profound that it roared. It didn't need to speak. Its presence alone was enough to convey the depth of its power, its hunger, its desire to break through into our world and bring with it a darkness that would consume everything. I knew that this was the moment. The diary in my hands was the key, the conduit through which the Watcher was attempting to manifest. I had to destroy it, to sever the connection before it was too late. But as I raised the diary, preparing to tear it apart, I felt an invisible force slam into me, knocking me back against the wall. The diary flew from my hands, landing open on the floor, its pages fluttering in a non-existent wind. The Watcher moved closer, its form growing more solid, more real with each passing second. The shadows around it seemed to dance in ecstasy, feeding off its power, off the fear that radiated from me like a beacon. I could feel my strength waning, my will crumbling under the weight of its presence. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, urging me to give in, to let go, to accept my fate as the vessel for this ancient, malevolent being. Desperation clawed at me. I had to act, had to stop it before I lost myself completely. With a surge of adrenaline, I lunged for the diary, my fingers brushing the worn leather cover just as the Watcher's shadowy tendrils lashed out, wrapping around my arms, my legs pulling me back. The cold was unbearable, seeping into my bones, freezing my blood. My vision blurred, darkness encroaching on the edges of my sight as the room around me seemed to warp and twist. But I couldn't give up. Not now. Not when I was so close. With every ounce of strength I had left, I fought against the tendrils, inching closer to the diary. The Watcher loomed over me, its form growing larger, more defined, its power pressing down on me like a vice. I could feel its hatred, its hunger, and it was all directed at me. It wanted to break me, to consume me, to use me as its gateway into this world. But I couldn't let that happen. I wouldn't let that happen. With a final, desperate effort, I grabbed the diary and pulled it to my chest. The tendrils tightened around me, squeezing the breath from my lungs, but I didn't stop. I tore at the pages, ripping them apart, scattering them across the floor. The watcher screamed, a sound that wasn't a sound at all, but a feeling, a vibration that shook the very foundations of the house, rattling my bones, filling my head with an unbearable pressure. The room erupted into chaos. The shadows thrashed wildly, the whispers reaching a deafening crescendo. The walls seemed to buckle, the floor to heave, as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. But I kept tearing, kept ripping the pages, until there was nothing left but scraps of paper, fluttering in the howling wind that had materialized out of nowhere. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The house fell silent, the shadows retreating, the air clearing. I was left lying on the floor, the remnants of the diary scattered around me, my body aching, my mind reeling. The watcher was gone, its presence dissipated, the oppressive weight that had filled the room lifted. But I knew it wasn't over. It could never be over. I sat up slowly, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart still pounding with the remnants of terror. The house was still, eerily so, as if it too was recovering from the ordeal. But there was no sense of relief, no feeling of victory. The darkness had retreated, but it hadn't been defeated. The watcher had been stopped for now, but I knew that it was only a matter of time before it found another way, another vessel. I had survived, but at what cost? The diary was destroyed, but the connection between me and the watcher remained. I could feel it, a lingering presence at the edge of my consciousness, waiting, watching, biding its time. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. I had seen the true face of terror, and I knew that it would never let me go. As I gathered the torn pages, my hands trembling, I realized that I could never return to the life I had known. The darkness had touched me, marked me, and I would carry that mark with me for the rest of my days. I was a part of the story now, a chapter in the cursed history of the forgotten diary, and there was no escaping it. The watcher was out there, somewhere, waiting for the next opportunity, the next unwitting soul to stumble upon its cursed tale. And when it did, the cycle would begin again, the darkness spreading, the terror escalating, until it consumed everything in its path. I had seen the truth, and it was more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. I was alone in the silent house, surrounded by the remnants of the nightmare, knowing that the true horror was not what I had faced, but what was still to come. The watcher was patient. The watcher was eternal, and it was only a matter of time before it returned. In the days following that harrowing night, I found myself living in a state of constant dread. The fear that had once been a shadow at the edge of my mind, now a relentless companion. The watcher might have been banished, for now, but the sense of its presence lingered, like the faint scent of smoke after a fire has been extinguished. I knew, deep down, that this was not the end. The darkness that had plagued my life, the terror that had seeped into every corner of my existence, was far from gone. It had simply retreated, biding its time, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. The diary, or what remained of it, lay in pieces on the floor. I had gathered the scraps of paper, the torn leather cover, and thrown them into the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed them. But even as the fire crackled and the remnants of the cursed book turned to ash, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. The watcher had been using the diary as a conduit, yes, but it was more than just ink and paper. It was an entity, a presence that couldn't be destroyed so easily. The diary was gone, but the connection to the watcher remained, like an invisible thread that tied me to the darkness. In the weeks that followed, I tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, but nothing felt the same. The world around me had changed, or maybe it was I who had changed. Colors seemed duller, sounds muted, as if reality itself had been tainted by the horrors I had witnessed. I no longer felt safe, not in my home, not anywhere. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, set my heart racing, a reminder that the darkness was still out there, watching, waiting. I began to notice things, small, insignificant at first, but unmistakable. The shadows in my house seemed to linger longer than they should, stretching out across the walls like dark tendrils, reaching for me. At night, when I tried to sleep, I would hear faint whispers just at the edge of my hearing, Too quiet to understand, but loud enough to keep me awake, trembling in fear. The reflection in the mirror no longer felt like mine. There was something off about it, something in the way the eyes stared back at me, hollow and distant, as if they belonged to someone or something else. One evening, as I sat alone in the darkened living room, the remnants of daylight fading away, I felt it again, that suffocating presence, that cold, unyielding gaze. I hadn't felt it so strongly since the night of the final confrontation, but there it was, unmistakable. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. I didn't need to turn around to know it was there. The Watcher had returned. The shadows in the room deepened, the light from the dying sun barely penetrating the darkness that seemed to swell around me. I could feel the temperature drop, the air growing thick and heavy with the same oppressive weight I had felt before. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing with fear, with the knowledge that I had never truly escaped. The Watcher had merely allowed me a brief reprieve, a momentary illusion of safety before it came back to claim what was its due. The whispers started again, louder this time, more insistent. They filled the room, coming from every direction, an unintelligible chorus of voices that seemed to grow closer, pressing in on me. I clenched my fists, trying to block them out. But they only grew louder until they were all I could hear, drowning out my thoughts, my reason. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows creeping toward me, inch by inch, as if they were alive, reaching out to pull me back into the darkness. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the presence withdrew. The whispers faded, the shadows receded, and the air in the room lightened, as if a great weight had been lifted. But the relief was fleeting. I knew that this was no victory. The Watcher hadn't been defeated. It had simply stepped back, allowing me to breathe, to think, but never to forget. It was playing with me, toying with my fear, feeding off my terror. I began to realize that this was my life now. The Watcher had marked me, claimed me as its own, and there was no escaping that fate. It would always be there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I could try to ignore it, try to pretend that everything was normal, but it would only be a matter of time before it made its presence known again, reminding me that I was never truly alone. In the days that followed, I became a shell of my former self. I withdrew from friends, from family, from the world, afraid that the darkness that followed me would spread to them, that the Watcher would claim more victims. I barely slept, barely ate, my mind consumed by the constant fear, the ever-present knowledge that the terror was never far away. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, the darkness, the shadows, the figure standing at the edge of my vision, waiting, watching. And then, one night I found something that sent a chill through me, unlike anything I had felt before. As I sat in my dimly lit room, staring at the blank page of a notebook, trying to make sense of the madness that had taken over my life, I noticed something strange. The paper, which had been clean and white just moments before, was now covered in words that I hadn't written. The handwriting was familiar, a messy scrawl that I recognized from the diary. But it wasn't the words themselves that terrified me, it was what they said. The message was simple, chilling in its finality. "You are next." I dropped the notebook, my hands trembling, the room spinning around me. The Watcher had found a new way to communicate, a new way to remind me that it was still there, still in control. The diary might have been destroyed, but the curse lived on, transferred to me, binding me to the darkness that had claimed so many before. I knew then that there was no escape, no way to rid myself of the terror that had taken hold of my life. The Watcher was patient, eternal, and it had all the time in the world to torment me, to wear me down, to drag me into the abyss. I was its vessel, its chosen one, and it would not stop until it had consumed me completely. As I sat in the darkness, the shadows closing in once more, I realized that the true horror was not in the things I had seen, the things I had experienced, but in the knowledge that this was only the beginning. The Watcher would continue to haunt me, to stalk me through the shadows, to whisper in the dead of night. It would never let me go, never allow me peace. The house was silent now, but it was a silence filled with dread, with the knowledge that the terror would return, stronger, more insidious than before. I was trapped in a nightmare with no end, a story that had no conclusion, only an endless cycle of fear, of darkness, of a presence that would never let me rest. And so I wait, day after day, night after night, knowing that it is out there, waiting, watching. The watcher is patient, and it will come for me when I least expect it, when I am at my weakest, my most vulnerable. And when it does, I know that there will be no escape, no salvation, only the cold, unyielding embrace of the darkness that it brings.